May I start with the
Yes, please.
point? So, good evening, everyone. On behalf of the English Literary Association, Sri Venkateswara College, I welcome you all to the second webinar of our Diamond Jubilee celebrations, 40 years of Fefu and Friends, with our esteemed guest, Mr. Ramu Ramanathan, sir. Mr. Ramanathan is a renowned playwright and director. He is known for plays like Cotton 56, Polyester 84, Comrade Kumbhakarn, and Mahadev Bhai. 8 of his plays have been anthologized in the book 3, Sakina Manzil, and other plays. He is also the author of the poetry collection My Encounters with a Peacock and To Sit on a Stone with Other Thoughts. Mr. Ramanathan writes on theatre and culture in newspapers and periodicals. He has been associated with the printing industry for 3 decades as a journalist, and he is also the editor of Print Week and What Packaging magazine. We welcome you, sir. I would now like to request Dr. Reena Ramdev to start this evening conversation with sir.
Okay. Thank you, Nishi, and welcome back, Ramu. We've had the rare privilege of hosting you more than once at Venkateswara, and on every occasion, there's been a mine of information on theatre and its history, both classical and closer home locally, also on scripting, playwriting that you've shared and opened up for us, enriching really every bit of the way we bring the teaching of drama into our classrooms. Today's conversation is on Maria Fornes's Fefu and Friends, marking 40 years of its appearance on Broadway. Very sort of Chekhovian in spirit, even as Fornes, when asked, says that this was entirely unintentional since she hadn't really studied Chekhov sort of formally. It's a play that's newly been introduced and to us at DU, and this is the first time that it will be taught here in DU classrooms. And it's part of our beleaguered women's writing course. A feminist play peopled by women who tap into the whimsical, giving it a deceptive lightness of touch, even in conversations that are there around death and killing. And this is also where the broad understanding of it as being plotless takes off from. A plotless play for foreigners doesn't deal with the mechanics of the practical arrangements of life, as she says, but with the mechanics of the mind, a spiritual survival, a process of thought. Interestingly, Fornes had herself taken charge of its staging and direction, experimenting with the form by setting the middle section in 4 different rooms, with the audience breaking up into groups and each group taking turns eavesdropping on a different set of characters. In terms of its moving, shifting stage and other improvisations that she strips bourgeois realist theatre of, I can think of no one better than Ramu to talk us through the play's non-conforming stylized setting, the feminist intent in all its whimsical detailing, and all other insights that 40 years of Fefu and her friends holds for us today. Over to you, Ramu.
Thank you very much. Uh, so first and foremost, I must thank you because I had not read this play. So thanks to your prodding, number one, I read the play, and because one has to have this conversation, read it fairly carefully. I must also thank Himali Kothari and the Readings in the Shed because um, having read the play twice or thrice by myself, I realize I'm not getting the register. So they have a group in Mumbai, and they organized an online reading of the play, I think 2 Sundays ago, one Sunday morning. Um, that for me was an eye opener because many things fell into place. You know, as they say, text is one part of theater, but it's also the performance and hearing the actors' voices that is truly beneficial. So, for students, one of the things I would genuinely request is, of course, read the play text. That's important, but try to do cold readings among yourself, with each of you taking on one of the 8 women, and just hearing these 8 magnificent women essay the parts, or those lines, that just everything just falls into place. um, what I'm going to try to do over the next few minutes, in fact a couple of hours, is I've sort of broken this down into 10 points just for my own clarity. So imagine this as a play in 10 acts, and basically, in each point, I will try to sort of dwell at length at a few things that the play is talking about. So all I'm a playwright, as it was mentioned, and all theaters about great openings. And so, who better than Dionysus? And there's a line in Euripides' Bacchae where he says, "And here I stand, a god incognito disguised as man." That's the line. And here I stand, a god incognito disguised as man. So this is the line, which again sounds flat and neutral when you hear it just the way I've spoken it. Now imagine the same line like this, okay? And here I stand, a god incognito disguised as man. So just this little act of putting a mask in front is what theater is. And now imagine this same line being spoken by 10 Zora Segals. And that is sort of, how the play opens, the Euripides play. So when we are looking at this play text, imagine that you have great actors voicing these lines. Um, so one of the things I'd done while reading the play was also read some of the reviews which appeared in the American press. And a common sort of concern that emerged was, what is the play about? Um, and, so each of us as readers tend to respond to things based on one's own experience. About 2 decades ago, I used to live in a place called Flight View, which is sort of located in an area called Vakola, which is probably the boondocks of Mumbai. It's a suburb district of in Santa Cruz East, and basically it's where after the 92-93 riots, the people who had to move out of the riot zones of Malad and so on, they shifted to this particular place in Santa Cruz East. And just outside our building was where the rickshaws used to come, and to get into them you had to wait over there. And right next to that is what we have in Mumbai called the Sulabh Sauchalaya, which is like the common toilets. Now, Flight View was surrounded by bastis, huge amounts of bastis, basically all the migrants that moved out of these riot districts from other parts of the city, and they were, in a way, they settled down there. So for those of you who've come to Mumbai, when the plane lands on the runway, and what you see on either side of the runway, the bastis and the dense slums and the almost unhospitable conditions, that is, I'm talking of that area. So outside of this Sulabh Sauchalaya was the rickshaw stand, and which is where our building gate was located. And so you had to necessarily wait over there to get a rickshaw. Something interesting used to happen over there, which is that there used to be a bunch of women who were always standing over there and having conversations about nothing. And most of them would be either rubbing this tobacco juice on their gums, and the conversations would really be going nowhere. So that was sort of what was happening. It's only after about a few years I realized that these women who were assembled over there, and it used to be a bit irksome, because every time you're standing there at the gate, there would be this, a bunch of 8 to 9 women, just the same number as Fefu and her friends. And it's only then I realized that these women were basically waiting outside of the Sulabh Sauchalaya for their turn to enter the toilet. So there used to be 3 cubicles, and you had to wait. And so you can imagine this, basti with a population of thousands and thousands of these, women living over there. Now, the second thing was that because of the way Mumbai is and the way patriarchy functions in our society, these women were not allowed to get out of their homes. So the only time they could get out legitimately was if they had to go to use the toilet. So this was their only moment of freedom. And it was that moment of freedom which they clutched onto with, everything that they had. And so they delayed their going back to their homes. And by home, we are talking of 25 by 30 square feet structures in which about 8, 9, 10 people at times were used to stay in. So two things were happening. One is the placement of these 8 or 9 women day after day coming over there, having these conversations, which could be pleasantries, which could be about what was happening in their homes, which could be about each other, and then delaying their going back. Um, and the second thing was, of course, this being able to get away from the male gaze, in a sense. Uh, so when I read Fefu and her friends, the first thing that struck me is that, this is what the play is about 8 wonderful women coming together and having these conversations in which there is, in a way, no sort of, male participation. All right. So that was just the sort of introduction. My 10 points are as follows. The first one is Hedda Gabler. The reason I mentioned Hedda Gabler is because Maria Irene Fornes, in an interview, has mentioned that she had directed a production of this particular play text. And that for me was interesting on multiple counts. One is, of course, who Hedda represented. So Hedda, for those of you who are not familiar, is a play. Hedda Gabler is a play written by the great Norwegian playwright, dramatist Henrik Ibsen. The play was written in the 19th century, towards the end, which is approximately 1890 or thereabouts. The play, unlike The Doll's House, which is much more known and ends with the slamming of the door and Nora walking out of the house because she's sort of dissatisfied with domesticity, marriage, households, etc. In Hedda Gabler, we see a far more radical woman, a woman who, quote unquote, many have sort of said is almost villainous in that sense. Again, but argued that she probably did what was right, and in her own way was an extraordinary sort of character. The second thing, which is of great importance, is what Ibsen, along with, of course, Chekhov, whose name was alluded to some time ago, is the birth of the living room. All right, Ibsen and Chekhov, the two sort of greats. Uh, and again, you must understand this is the tradition from which Maria Irene Fornes is coming from. So there's Hedda Gabler on one side, this absolutely fabulous woman character written by a great dramatist, and what she is able to do with something similar, something similar. So you can almost see Fefu as an extension of Gabler in that sense. So that is one. The second is this whole tradition of the living room theater. All right. Now, understand that prior to this, the living room was not really the focus of the theater. The theater used to be, battlegrounds, as in the plays of, Shakespeare. It used to be mainly about the monarchs. It used to be mainly about, the court and palace intrigues. So primarily, theater was sort of, confined itself to these spaces, and more importantly, to the lives of the high and mighty. The gentrification of theater in that sense, or the bourgeoisification of theater, began with Ibsen and Chekhov to a large extent. So that is the tradition that is. And why did that happen? I mean, again, if you look at what was transpiring in Europe specifically, and of course, England, is essentially the Industrial Revolution. And a couple of things were happening. One is cities being born, and the second is urban societies. So if you read a Chekhov play or an Ibsen play, essentially it almost seems like a Surir Patwardhan painting coming alive, all right? And the same is true of Fefu and her friends. The first sequence itself is almost like a very beautiful Surir Patwardhan painting, of course, based in the US. The third thing is, again, one used to teach in a college of architecture, and came across an urban theorist by the name of Edward Soya, and he talks of something called the myth of the prison cell. Okay, and in this particular, his notion is that with the creation of cities, what essentially happened was we needed urban dwelling, we needed urban tenements, we needed housing for all these millions of people who were now living in this concentrated land. It was no longer the villas and the mansions, and the settlements spread across huge territories. And like a lot of things that transpired in the 20th century, the borrowings were from the military. And in this sense, a lot of the R&D that was done by the armies, especially the period between World War I and World War II, and also prior to that, you see that the military has been responsible for the way, uniforms have been made, the way our shoes have been made, the way, we started eating canned food and ration food, etc. One of the other contributions that the military started doing was creation of, again, huge numbers of their soldiers in this kind of urban space. All right. And then subsequently, of course, housing, uh, prisoners of wars, and later on when we heard of, concentration camps and so on. But anyway, what Edward Soya is telling us is that the way homes are basically based on the principle of how a prison cell is. And homes are just a marginal, a marginal modification of the concept of a prison cell. The prison cell has been designed to keep a person, within that, with sort of adequate amount of ventilation, some space to sleep, hopefully a mess and a pantry if possible. So the same concept is over there. So when we did read the plays of Ibsen and Chekhov, back then, the point is that these women characters were again trapped inside this kind of constraint, or this kind of, claustrophobia of the prison cell, quote unquote home, what we call home. So again, if you look at the 20 million residents of Mumbai and the kind of houses that they live in spite of, the beautification and the coming up of new sort of housing complexes, what you see is just a manifestation of this. And here again, what I'll do is just to give you a sense of this. Just a couple of weeks ago, one had done a similar talk on Mohan Rakesh. Mohan Rakesh's Aadhe Adhure, where this whole, again, idea of what the living room is, you see. The same living room that Maria Irene Fornes is talking about, Mohan Rakesh was talking about the same thing in his play Aadhe Adhure 10 years ago. So she was doing it in the 1970s and he was doing it towards the end of 1960s. So in Aadhe Adhure, interestingly enough, there is a character called Bini, and she is asking her mother, what is this idea of home? तो तुम बता सकती हो क्या मम्मा कि ये क्या चीज़ है और कहाँ है? इस घर के खिड़कियों में, दरवाज़ों में, छत में, तुम में, डैडी में, किन्नी में, किन्नी इज हर सिस्टर, अशोक में, अशोक इज हर एल्डर ब्रदर, कहाँ छिपी है ये मनहूस चीज़? कोई कह सकता है जो वो करता है, मैं इस घर को अपने अंदर लेकर गई हूँ, जो कहता है कि मैं उसे अपने घर के अंदर लेके गई हूँ. So this is what a male playwright like Mr. Rakesh is doing with his particular text. And we'll just very briefly, I know some of you have read the text, but we'll just see very briefly what Fornes is doing with her opening of Fefu and her children. So it starts off, with this description of a living room in a country house in New England, and she says in a sort of playful tone, my husband married me to have a constant reminder of how loathsome women are. Cindy says, what? Fefu says, yep. Cindy says, that's just awful. Fefu says, no, it isn't. Cindy says, it isn't awful. Fefu says, no. Cindy says, I don't think anyone would marry for that reason. Fefu says, he did. Cindy, did he say so? Fefu, he tells me constantly. Cindy says, oh dear. Fefu says, I don't mind. I laugh when he tells me. Cindy, you laugh? Fefu, I do. Cindy, how can you? Fefu, it's funny and it's true. That's why I laugh. Cindy, what is true? Fefu, that women are loathsome. Cindy, screams, Fefu. Fefu says that shocks you, and so on and so forth. So I'll sort of edit a bit. And again, we catch up with them a little later, and she says, I'm speechless. Why are you speechless? I think you're outrageous. And she says, don't be offended. I don't take enough care to be tactful. I know I don't. But don't be offended. Cindy is not offended. She pretends to be, but she isn't really. She understands what I mean. I do not. Anyway, the reason I'm sharing this is you can see the contrast, the self-loathing which is there in characters like Bini and so on and so forth, and also among the great American playwrights, the great British dramatists, as opposed to this sort of playful mischievousness that we are seeing over here. And then she makes a very important point a little later. Christina says, I avoid anything that's revolting to me. Fefu says, you too? Cindy, yes. And then Fefu says, and I think we need to pay attention to this because this is in a way resonating what Hedda Gabler told us about 100 years ago. Have you ever turned a stone over in a damp soil? Christina says, and when you turn it, there are worms crawling on it. Christina says, and it's damp and full of fungus. She says, were you revolted? Yes. But were you fascinated? Christina says, I was. Fefu says, there you have it. You too are fascinated with revulsion. Christina says, you see, that which is exposed to the exterior is smooth and dry and clean. That which is not underneath is slimy and filled with fungus and crawling with worms. It's another life that is parallel to the one we manifest. It's there. The way worms are underneath the stone. If you don't recognize it, it eats you. That is my opinion. Well, who's ready for lunch? And the immediate switch by the playwright and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there are other things which we'll probably dwell on. Point two, sorry, is openings. We looked at the opening, and it's again very, very interesting what happens at the beginning of this particular play. And this is something any student of theatre, any practitioner of theatre spends a lot of time on, because playwrights traditionally spend a lot of time in a way conjuring the perfect opening. All right. So, for example, if you look at Lorca's The House of Bernarda Alba, and again a play once refers to, because again an all women this thing repertoire of characters. The premise of the play is that there's a death and the women are in mourning. And now, very interestingly, Bernarda Alba's first utterance is silence. And interestingly enough, what Lorca does is the last utterance of Bernarda Alba is also silence. All right. And then through the play, from silence in the beginning to silence at the end, a journey is sort of conjured by the playwright while the mourning is on, and the various characters then manifest themselves. So that is again something as a formula to pay attention to. Similarly, there's a play that one read recently by Michael Frayn called Copenhagen, which is basically the famous question about what is right and wrong and the ethics of war, especially among scientists. So the premises in the city of Copenhagen, Heisenberg comes to meet Mr. Bohr, and there are only three characters in the play: Mr. and Mrs. Niels Bohr and Heisenberg. And the play starts off with this. The first line is "But why," which is what Mrs. Bohr asks. But why? And that is the sort of the theme of the play. So the opening line is "But why," and that is also the question of the fundamental question of not just why did Heisenberg come to Copenhagen, but also why man created this sort of demonic atomic bomb, which was ultimately going to result in the death of so many lives and so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, in the case of Mohan Rakesh's play also, the first line is very crucial when the main protagonist, she says as she walks in, and the first word she utters is "oof, oof, oof," which again is a sort of manifestation of that kind of inarticulate, that we have essentially become this kind of an inarticulate society. So we'll just quickly see what she has done. The first line that she says, and it's a great opening line, is, "My husband married me to have a constant reminder of how loathsome women are." That's the first line of, and what it does is a couple of things. One is it sort of lays the foundation of the rest of the play, and also casts sort of a whole lot of questions in our mind. Now, interestingly enough, what is the last line of the play? And again, it is uttered by Fefu. So again, the kind of sort of trajectory that we see with Lorca, we see even Furness do that. So she says, "I killed it. I just shot and killed it, Julia." And for those of you who've read the text, you know what has happened at the end and what is happening to Julia. So this connection between loathsome women, husband, and then "I killed it," the sort of dramatic this thing. Now, again, what is interesting is if you read the interviews of what she has given in public platforms, etc., is this whole idea of what is called plotless, and I'll dwell on that, especially when we look at the unit on theater of the absurd, which I think is a crucial aspect of this particular play. But we have, unfortunately, the way our ads are made, the way Hindi cinema is made, the way even web series is made, we have been in a way programmed into looking at everything as a beginning, middle, and end. And that is how the human process, the mind has been processed in that kind of a way. So to deprogram ourselves, as theater audiences, as theater students, as even practitioners of theater, sometimes becomes difficult. Deprogram, but then offer what? So that is something that she has very, very consciously done, and she's also very good at it. It's not just a question of having rejected the beginning, middle, and end. She is so again, just referring to a couple of greats from the Indian tradition, sorry, Abhinav Gupta and Acharya Untak. So Abhinav Gupta is the gentleman who wrote the treatise on Natya Shastra. Initially, he spoke about the eight rasas and then, of course, added the ninth one. So he talks of three critical components, which is Kathavastu, Neta, and Rasa. And you see uh, the presence of that. So Kathavastu in sort of a synonym for that would be plot. Neta would be characters, and Rasa is that which creates a sense in the audience while they're watching the play unfold. All right. So this would be the broad three things. But Acharya Kuntak, who comes in a few centuries later, talks about something called Itivrata. And to understand specifically what is happening in Fefu and her friends is to understand what this Itivrata is. So Itivrata is basically that which is unveiled very, very slowly. So it's like listening to a good symphony by Bach, or just like listening to Chick Corea or even John Coltrane, where the jazz notations just keep unveiling themselves one after another. So again, it may not fit into the traditional this thing of a song with a beginning, middle, and end, but like a jazz piece, you could have a hook and then departures and deviations and digressions and so on and so forth. So that which is involved, like when the gunshot happens at the end, when Fefu shoots, and then what happens to Julia, when we walk out of the auditorium, or in this case, when we have read the play text, we have to infer what is happening. And again, there's an interesting thing, because even in a play like gunshot, as a in this particular play, you can see the technique, or rather the way of the gunshot being used. That if there's a gun, you use it, and then there's a technique that you indicate. All right. Now, when a playwright of this stature, and the reason we are sort of discussing this is, of course, the fact that it's successful, B, it's made a mark, and third, that in a play which is still grappling with its origins in the 19th century, this is an important aspect. So when when we confront a text like this, what we do is we look at
Ramu, we
sorry,
lost
I
you for about,
went.
yeah, for the last
Shall I
maybe
restart?
2 3 minutes. Yes, please. I think when you were
Yeah.
talking about jazz, that's when it sort of started
Reena,
breaking.
should I just start again, or?
Yeah, from the last 5 minutes. Can you hear me, Ramu? Okay, just a minute. Let me just try and call. Arya, can you see what's happening? I mean, can you figure it out?
Ma'am, it's just, I think his network. I don't think I can do anything from here. He seems to, yeah, be
That
losing.
was a little, yeah. Yeah, Ramu.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is all upside down. Apologies about that. Can I be seen and heard?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry about that. So anyway, I'm on the phone.
Huh.
Yeah. So one of the things that she says, one second, let's try to get this sorted. Yeah. So one of the things she says is we live in the day and age of ideological putrefaction, where one and only one dominant thought swallows all thought. And which is why that, the presence of that kind of itivrata becomes absolutely crucial. And just to give you context, because a lot of us, we are consuming, web series, we are consuming content through apps. What happens with that is a certain kind of instant gratification, which is what itivrata is not. And great plays do that. And that is the sort of, tradition that when we look at a play text like, Fefu and her friends, is what we need to do. Again, I'll just quote a line from that because these are lines from the text itself. And so she says, the character says, I feel we are constantly threatened by death every second. Every instant it's there, and every moment something rescues us. Something rescues us from death. Now, this is what we have to, consider when we're looking at that gunshot towards the end. Something rescues us from death every moment of our lives. For every moment we live, we have to thank something. We have to be grateful to something. And that fights for us and saves us. And, in a way, one can look at it as something about life being fickle, but one can also look at it as, an extension of what has transpired with the whole Ibsenian tradition of Hedda Gabler, where the woman is no longer the sort of self-sacrificing model on stage, as opposed to, the kind of celebratory character that we are now seeing in Fefu. Point three is again off stage, and for me, this is something which is absolutely crucial, and I think it's important because sometimes in our hurry to consider play text, we tend to look at it as two-dimensional. But there's always something that is happening off stage, not just in the wings, as in the case of Godot, where waiting for Godot, where the wings signify something that is scary, or that is, there is horror in the shadows, as it were. But there is something that is transpiring off stage. So, for example, if you read Chekhov, and again, Professor Reena had mentioned Chekhov and the tradition again, because this particular text, Fefu and her Friends, is very much like Seagull in that sense. But when you read Chekhov's Seagull, or you read, Uncle Vanya, or you read The Three Sisters, there are, I think, 3-4 things happening on stage. At times, it almost seems that there is very little transpiring in the lives of these individuals. There is not too much, over dramatization in terms of the plot, the kathavastu that was spoken of. There is not dramatic changes in the neta, the characters. There's not that much that is being indicated in, the rasa theory. But what is transpiring is off stage. And what I think what someone like Chekhov is doing is tracing the journey of Russian society from the Tsar to, what the Bolsheviks did from 1850, 1860s onwards to, of course, the famous October Revolution. So something is happening outside, all right? And we are now seeing a shift in a power, but we're also seeing a shift in the kind of way people live their lives. Now, interestingly enough, with Fefu and her friends too, there is something interesting that is transpiring off stage. And again, this requires a careful and much thought of conversation. But I'll just list 2 or 3 things. So be aware that these these 4 or 5. So here is someone who is of a modern theater sensibility, who has imbibed a great many lessons from the youth revolutions of the 60s and 70s and what have you. She's written a play which she started writing in the 60s, which is when, the American civil society was at its questioning most and its most brutal. But she's located the play in 1935, all right? So there are 4 or 5 things which is going on. One is this male-female binary, which up till then we have been seeing on stage merely because 99% of our playwrights have been male. And in that sense, the voices were mainly male playwrights, or the authorial voices were mainly that of male playwrights. This is for the first time we see a whole crop of playwrights, appearing in both Europe as well as in the US, which in a sense passed the Bechdel test, you see, which is representation of women in fiction. So having more than 2 women on stage, having conversations which exclude men, and at the same time conversations which are crucial to the Kathavastu. So that is number one. Number two, again, is very interesting to just the dates that are there. So 1935 is when you have FDR in power in the US, that is Roosevelt. 1977, 1978 is when you have the shift from Nixon Ford to Carter. So that's happening on when the play was staged. And 1935 is when the action on stage is transpiring among these 8 women. Now, mind you, because we in India we have got universal right to vote, thanks to our founding fathers almost simultaneously. In America, it was a long drawn battle. So 1920 was probably the time when the 19th Amendment was sort of passed, and women's right to vote was sort of exercised for the first time. So this is the generation after that which is finally getting its right to A, vote, and B, also to assert itself. So the sort of voicing and articulation of that. And now another crucial year that appears is 1965, which is voting rights, which is prohibits racial discrimination in voting. So this is the kind of journey that we've seen the American civil state taking place. And this play is sort of located bang in the middle of all this turmoil that is transpiring in the lives of these women. So that is point number two. Point number three, again, I sort of alluded to that, is the 60s movement, essentially. So what transpires, A, with Vietnam, B, what transpires with, all the entire quest and question of, questioning authority. And among that also patriarchy to a large extent. So that happened. And the most important thing was, of course, modernity. American society, in a way, sort of embracing a certain kind of modernity which rejected a whole sort of values, especially post 1965 onwards, after the universal right to vote. So these are the sort of crucial, roadmaps against which this play's trajectory should be sort of looked at. That these are the sort of actions which are transpiring, which is influencing what these women are doing and staging on, when the staging is transpiring. The fourth point is essentially something to do with what is called the director's text. And here I again refer to someone who's was a collaborator of the playwright. And this is, I don't know if you can see this. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I've sort of pulled this book out. This is the great Herbert Bloch. He was a dramaturg and he was also a theater director and all of that. Now, interestingly enough, the reason I pulled this out is this is someone with whom, Maria Fen sort of collaborates with. So there was again a reference that she directed her own text. So there are 2-3 things. One is the playwright writing a play text, and there is always this interesting access, especially with theater, as to whose play it is: the playwrights, the directors, the actors, or the audience. And in England, to a large extent, it was always thought that theater is the playwriting medium. In Germany and in the US, for instance, it is always believed that it's a director's text. So playwrights have always had to, grapple with, in a way, regaining control over their own words, regaining control even about how the text is performed. So again, there's this sort of wonderful saying that you could have a good crop, but it's of no use if there is no harvest. So you may have written a great play text, but it's of no use unless and until it is translated to its fullest potential on stage. And this was something, again, with a play like Fefu and Her Friends, and again, her whole approach to playwriting and how the play should be, that she worked a lot in tandem with her directors on the rehearsal floor. Again, I'm going to be referring to I'll take this kind of an example to just illustrate the point that I'm trying to make. So this is Mohan Rakesh. The reason I'm again mentioning it is that playwrights generally don't work in isolation. They're always working in tandem with, theater companies and directors. And the reason I'm mentioning Mohan Rakesh is also because when he did Aadhe Adhure, he was in Delhi. He worked in close collaboration with a group called Deshantar, which is a Delhi-based group. And they used to rehearse in a school inside Delhi. And a couple of things happened. One is Mohan Rakesh attended all the rehearsals. Again, this is, the same thing that is, transpiring with Maria. The other thing is that in addition to being in the room, lines were being written and rewritten constantly to suit uh, the whole tonality or the register of a particular character. That if dialogue is there to give, weightage to a particular character, to what extent should a playwright's contribution, what is working, what is not working. So in a way, the rehearsal room becomes a kind of an R&D lab for, the final stage production to be embarked on. Now, in the case of Aadhe Adhure, it's again quite interesting, because the decision that Om Shiv Puri, the actor, and who was also the director of the production, and also the owner of the theatre company, not owner, the head of the theatre company, Deshantar, is the decision to play all the male parts in Aadhe Adhure. So that decision is taken in the rehearsal room along with Mohan Rakesh, and then of course, the play goes on to become a landmark thing. But this is again not something that was, decided in the pre-text stage. It was something that was worked out in the rehearsal room. So she also comes from that tradition of theater where you're always working and, fixing the nuts and bolts, as it were, in the rehearsal room to ensure that the final text is done. And this is essentially done through what we in the Hindustani classical tradition call riyaz, repetition, recall, the recall of memory, that you constantly keep doing it again and again, and you find a solution to this whole thing. And what are the things that she's stressing on? And you find, again, I'm just going to highlight three, because I think all three are very important from the point of view of Fefu and Her Friends. One is matching character with phrase, because I think that is absolutely crucial. Dialogue is that which gives, character. What is dialogue writing in theater, for instance? So that is one. Then again, because the play has dialogues and monologues, how do you sort of manage the discrepancies? And also, again, very interesting in Fefu and Her Friends is who these characters are talking to. And that, I think, holds a very critical key. And you can see how characters are constantly shifting register. And that is an incredible feat. I mean, there is, huge amount of talent to be able to do that when there are 8 characters in a play, that every time there is a different person who's being addressed to, you will find a tonal register shift. And I'll just give you an example in your own lives. The way, some of you would be talking to your younger brother would be very different if, even if you're saying the same sentence, like something very banal, like, get me my cup of coffee, or can you pass the phone? The way you say it to a younger brother, to the way you say it to, your parents, or the way you say it to your grandparents, to the way you say it to your boss, or whatever. So this kind of tonal shift to be able to achieve with this degree of finesse within that. So 2 things. One is what the work that is being done in the pre-text stage. In addition to that, also the work that is being done in the rehearsal room, in this kind of a very healthy collaborative tradition, which is also the reason why I suspect she, took charge of her first play production. And this is a huge tradition in the US. Arthur Miller is known to have sort of begun this whole legacy where you work a lot on the first play production along with your, theater director. Since we were on the subject of Herbert Bloch, I come back to Bloch. And because that is my 5th point, which is theater of the absurd. Now, Bloch is also the person who is known for doing huge amounts of work on Samuel Beckett. And one of the reasons he shot to fame was his famous production of Godot inside a prison cell. And there are rumors that that was probably one of the best productions of the play. And the prisoners who were watching, waiting for Godot inside a prison cell in Saint Quentin, they were the ones who sort of, the play resonated the most with them. This whole thing of alienation, this whole thing of, the absurdity of human existence and about life being a prison cell. So be it in a living room play or even inside a play like Godot. So couple of things. She obviously collaborated a great deal with Bloch. And interestingly enough, you can see the resonance of a lot of the theater of the absurd, even in a play like Fefu and Her Children. And what is theater of the absurd? Again, I'll just illustrate. So because of the laptop conking off, I forgot to show a whole lot of books. So this is like, you could call him the Bap of the theater of the absurd. This is Beckett. And again, a very, very important play production. So a few things happened post World War II, that is 1940s onward. This is Samuel Beckett, and what happens with Beckett is he's Irish. He comes from Dublin and escapes that city. This is also the city of James Joyce. It's also the city of Shaw. It's also the city of Wilde. It's also the city of Yeats. He escapes that city because of the Catholicity of the whole thing, etc. Goes to the continent, lives in a country like France. And when he lives over there, he's a neutral citizen. But lo and behold, here he is a neutral citizen in a country. And suddenly that country is run over by the Nazis. And he feels while he's in that country that, what is this? This is just, utterly meaningless. The whole meaningless of human existence. That here I am living in a foreign country, which is being run over by another country, and suddenly there is chaos all around. And what is the purpose of human existence? Around that time, a couple of things happen. One is that he is stabbed by a completely, one of those incidents which have no head or tail to it. There's no logic to it. And he gets stabbed and he gets hospitalized. He's stabbed by somebody who is a kind of a tramp. And again, certain questions start sort of, resonating inside his head. And that is around the time when he's doing this kind of deep questioning that he starts, conjuring these plays like, Godot and so on. So what is Godot? Godot is basically two tramps, Vladimir and Estragon, and they're waiting for Godot to arrive, and Godot never arrives. And that is the play. So for those who find Fefu and Her Friends plotless, or they say, what is the play about? Something like Godot, Waiting for Godot, which precedes it, would seem even that much more, that there really is no plot construction in the truest sense of the term. And it's just about two tramps, Vladimir and Estragon, whom we see, the kind of tramps you see anywhere and everywhere, even in India, railway stations, bus stands, chai ki tapri, vagera, vagera. So that's what the play is about. And basically, we are looking at people. So I mentioned Ibsen and Chekhov to you a short while ago. So, with Shakespeare, we have the monarchs and the high and mighty. Then with Ibsen and Chekhov, we have the gentrification and the bourgeoisification and the middle class finally getting a voice on stage. Suddenly, with the likes of Beckett, we find that the people who have been forgotten, the people who have been left behind, the absolute dregs of human society, they are now put on stage and they are being given a voice, and they are talking about their concerns, and they are talking about, things of great importance, and things like that. Around this time, again, you have the great myth of Sisyphus, which is written, which is about, again, questioning the utter futility of human existence. The myth of Sisyphus is about this gentleman who pushes a rock up a huge mountain, and just when he feels that he's achieved his targets, his goals, his ambitions, etc., he heaves a sigh of relief, wipes the sweat off his brow, and the boulder rolls back down to ground zero. He again has to go down and push it up. And that's what, human existence, modern day existence is all about. That's what people like Beckett, Ionesco, a whole lot of masters have started doing around that point of time. Now, the interesting thing about Waiting for Godot, and I'm going to dwell on that because there is a link with, our playwright as well,
it gets transpired in addition to be on the stage is also transpiring inside a boxing ring. So instead of them, it being Vladimir and Estrogen being two tramps waiting in a by the roadside, you have two boxers, two pugilists who are fighting it out, and they become Vladimir and Estrogen, and the referee becomes Pozo, and the assistant who throws in the towel becomes Lucky. Then there is Waiting for Godot inside a chicken pen, where all the chickens become Vladimir and Estrogen, because it's almost similar to what is transpiring with uh, you know uh, with human life in France or things like that. Interestingly enough, there was also a production in Delhi that I've seen, a student production. I think it was Keval Arora's college, Tirodimal, if I'm not mistaken, which is it was a play set in the time of the the Khalistan problem, and you have Vladimir and Estrogen in a kind of a Punjabi dialect, and they are waiting at the chai tapri, waiting for Pozo to arrive. And at the end of the first act, you have a huge explosion. And when Act 2 begins, Vladimir and Estrogen now are victims of that bomb explosion, and and that is sort of part 2. And in that particular production, Godot becomes peace. So this whole thing of a metaphor, of this whole thing of a symbol, those kind of things. And interestingly enough, there was also an all-women cast of Waiting for Godot, again set inside a living room. And curiously enough, Beckett, who otherwise was absolutely disinterested in any of the play productions of his own play, that was the only play against which only production about which he objected. He didn't mind his play being chopped into one act. He didn't mind anything else. But this all-women staging of Godot was something that he objected to. And he sued. So 2-3 links. One is this space defining what Godot was, and then Beckett responding in the way he did to this kind of an all-women representation. The theater of the absurd again became a very potent kind of a theater movement, and also a kind of theater technique, more importantly, because in addition to this kind of existentialist crisis that we were seeing in Europe, especially, it started manifesting itself in many other ways. So, for example, the East Europeans adapted theater of the absurd, but then they adapted it into the kind of political reality that they were living in. So, people like Václav Havel, people like Mrozek in Poland, and so on and so forth, where they use the theater of, like the Delhi production of Godot, they use the theater of the absurd to make a very strong political statement against a very omnipotent and powerful totalitarian regime. All right. And one of the what shall I say, children of the theater of the absurd is again this particular playwright whom I'm reading right now. This is a biography by Hermione Lee, talking about Tom Stoppard, and the reason I'm sharing this with you is that he is a contemporary of Mariari and this thing. And the point is that there is so much that we know about Stoppard, and there is so little that we know about her, and that is the extraordinary thing. Now, Stoppard does something equally fun with the theater of the absurd. He takes two absolutely irrelevant and maybe not irrelevant, but obscure characters in Hamlet, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and place them on stage. So they have probably a cameo in the original Shakespeare play text, but he brings them from there. So in a way, he takes the Vladimir and Estrogen of Hamlet, and he brings them on center stage, and makes them the center of that kind of a universe. Now, interestingly enough, in this book, there are a couple of absolutely brilliant anecdotes where Stoppard talks about helping out a theater director or a play production who are working on the play text that he has written. And he says that there is a very fine line which distinguishes helping from interfering. And in that sense, how theater and plays are so peculiar, and they're so unusual because of this sort of polyphony of voices that are constantly there, and also the number of people who are involved in actually the realization of that. Anyway, the reason to dwell at length on the theater of the absurd is that it is this technique or this movement that Irene Maria Fornes is a child of. She's a child of this tradition. She's inherited it. Now, what is interesting is she's obviously found a way of embellishing it with her own way of playwriting. So it's not Beckett, it's not Ionesco, it's not Genet, it's not Havel, it's not Stoppard, and it's not even Pinter. And what she's doing with plays like Fefu and Her Children, etc., is a manifestation of that. Point number 6 is language. And I think this is crucial because, again, what you have to keep in mind is that when we talk theater, we are also responding to many kinds of languages which are, being spoken on stage, and that which, we are hearing, the auditory. So we always say that we are audience, and we say that because of the audio, the audio factor in a play. So, I mean, again, as students of literature, as students of theater, you know that there's the classical, there's the privileged, there's the dialectical commentary that, people like David Hare, Brecht, etc. do. So there are 2-3 things that, Fefu achieves. And again, you have to be attentive to that. She does something. So if you look at playwriting or dialogue writing as the classical, as the privileged, as the, as a bombastic commentary, etc., she's obviously rejecting all those, just as she's rejecting the beginning, middle, and end structure, she's also rejecting this entire thing. What she is using is that if you draw parallel music, if in music you have Beethoven and Mozart and Schubert and Wagner, etc., she's saying, I don't want this. What I want is kind of like the the flexibility of jazz, short, sharp notes, the ability to say a lot with very little, that kind of minimalism, and to use half sentences to make big points. So this is something that she has consciously arrived at. And again, I'm going to share something because I think it is valuable. This was a kind of a thought experience, in the 1940s, a linguist by the name of Sam Hayakawa devised a concept for his in the University of Wisconsin. Okay, and that what is language and what is the kind of language civil society uses, what is the kind of language politicians use, what is the kind of language journalism uses, and also what is the kind of language literature uses. So in the case of Hayakawa, because he was alarmed by this whole sort of fascist propaganda, and I'll read these bits out because, again, this is the kind of thought that has gone to the language structure of Fefu and Her Friends. So what Hayakawa wanted his students to be aware of was that when words unfasten themselves from observable reality, and this can be all kinds, can be the reality of popular culture, it can be, as I mentioned, reality of politics. And that language is the lifeblood of what he called the huge cooperative nervous system of society. And for that nervous system to work, language had to work very well as well. So, so again, I'll now just, for the sake of time, what Hayakawa said that all nouns and noun phrases in the world are on a ladder. And on the bottom rung of this tall ladder sit the most concrete nouns, which is things like chairs, walls, hands, feet. And then in the middle part of that ladder, you have what is called specific general words that sit somewhere between the abstract, which is at the top, and the concrete. And then these words are both real and categories for things. So breakfast, cigarettes, leftovers, etc. And then they're concrete but cannot be counted or split into single units. So hence clothing, not underpants, fruit, not bunch of grapes, etc. And then on the top is what is called the abstract nouns. Although some of these are like depression or cancer, they feel scarily real. So the ladder is concrete. If you mean the one with vertical poles and horizontal rungs that you use to clear out your guttering, but abstract if you mean the figurative one that gave to his whole concept. And this is known as the ladder of abstraction. innumerable playwrights, they may be consciously or unconsciously, they're aware of this ladder of abstraction about, what to do with nouns, what to do with verbs, what to do with, participles, etc. So again, just to clarify, there's nothing wrong with abstract nouns, but when you're constructing sentences, and theater is about language, it is about words, it's about the celebration of bringing all this together. What you do with the sort of concrete things is how do you make it evocative? How do you link it with broad notions? Some of the things that I've been saying. How do you make, the hidden codes, the half sentences, the references to to the occurrences of stage, and at the same time, unfortunately, what happens, as Hayakawa points out, is with abstraction, you fog the meaning. There is a blur. It may not mean the same thing to different people. All right. But the fog can be welcoming because at the end of it, there might be illumination. There is lucidity. And abstractions may be vague, but they're inclusively so. And in the hands of a very, very good playwright, what you could find is that this lucidity is possible, is sort of this thing. So, for example, arguments that use only abstract nouns like truth, like power, like knowledge, are hard to care about because writing that sidesteps is the senses that does. Anyway, so on and so forth. So this is a concept, and again, playwrights who are careful about this. What is the language that we are hearing that's spoken on the streets? The spoken. How do we translate that, and how do we, create a create a mixture of that? And so what she does is she grasps the big ideas through these concrete things, and then concrete things through big ideas. And that is sort of the success of a play like Fefu and Friends. And what is again interesting is that the tangible ignites the elusive, and both of them shine brighter. So this is in a sort of crux what someone like Hayakawa is doing. Now, what is interesting is that the reason I've stressed on this at such length is also because the English language itself is, to paraphrase Hayakawa, is becoming nounier. There are more nouns than verbs. And only a seventh of the verbs which are in the dictionary are verbs. And even in sort of popular polls and popular lists, you will find verbs don't, are not listed. So which is interesting. Every time we say a playwright is verbalizing, what a playwright is very consciously doing is putting verbs on stage. And this movement of constant activity in lieu of whatever this whole Hayakawa's ladder of abstraction is something that has to be understood. And this is something that she does very magnificently. And, as an exercise, you can just see if a dictionary only seventh of the words are traditionally are verbs, you can just factor for yourself how many verbs she's using in the play text. And which is why it constantly gives you this feeling of movement. It also gives you this feeling of momentum. All right. And this is something that, again, I'm going to read because it's important and I don't want to, err on this. But why verbs are important and why her usage of verbs in these plays are so important. So I quote here, society is made up of people and people do not have predictability. So people do not have predictability like stars, like rocks or other animals. We are contrarians. We are full of capricious energies and self-defeating desires. We are mysteries to each other and we are mysterious even to ourselves. Therefore, people act like verbs. People do not act like nouns. And which is why I was sort of stressing on this point. Sometimes, unfortunately, what happens is we use words like, we say things like language. We use it in sort of very careless usage of it as in, popular this thing. It is important when we are talking of playwriting because it is this whole notion of, how carefully words are judiciously chosen and put on stage, that this has to be understood. The theory behind this has to be, carefully understood. All right. The seventh point that I'm trying to make is of space, because, the second act and how she sort of mobilizes that space. And I'll come to that a little bit. Again, she worked with somebody called Rossini, Luigi Rossini, who had done a lot of this kind of, work where the play moves. So, we are used to seeing theater in the two-dimensional, that we see a photograph on stage and then, the characters are sort of, they step out occasionally from the photograph and they talk to us. What she and people like Rossini prior to her have tried to do is essentially ensure that that does not happen. And again, we have some interesting examples. There was a production of Steinberg's Miss Julia, which I'd seen in Mumbai. This was done by on the Kulsum Terrace, which is the house which belongs to the theater unit group. And they had staged Miss Julia. And the way they staged it was interesting. As a theater audience, I walk into a house which belongs to the characters, and we become, there are about 30 to 40 of us, and we become, there are chairs which are kept aside, kept alongside the walls, and the action is taking place in 3 to 4 rooms. So you are actually, in addition to just listening, you're also part and parcel of that action on stage. So you're watching every action, you're seeing every single detail, you're part of the household, every single prop comes to life because there's a light bulb, there's, 101 things and items. It's like going to someone's house and a play unfolding. So again, that was an extremely interesting kind of an experience. Then again, we saw production of Three Sisters in Brussels, where you walk into the house of, it's a 3-story house, and you move along with them, and different actions are constantly transpiring. In India too, I think we have site-specific work, which is slightly different from what she's trying to do with Fefu and her children, which is, what Deepan did with his adaptation of Kasakande Itihasam, where in the village of Kodangalur, he enacted the entire play 3.5 hours in a stadium. And, the characters come and there's an audience of about 1,000 to 1,500 who are part and parcel of that kind of an experience, which is almost like a spectacle, like, the old Greek theater. Likewise, what Alkazi Stab did at Pirosha Costa Auditorium. But again, what I'll do is, I will, since she is very much part of the American experience, her own staging, that is Maria Irene Fornes's own staging, I'll again go back to her friend Herbert Blaw. See this particular text, book. So this is, Blaw has written about this thing, that what she is trying to do. So I'll just read these bits out. And this book is called Audience, and it's really about the changing role of audience in the theater over about 2,500 years. So what he says is a couple of things. We are aware of movement. What is this movement? Should it be active or should it be passive? And this is part of the larger question on theater, especially in the 20th century, because don't forget, we're also competing with the other art forms, right? So what are the recoils? What are the forward searches? The question of who is acting, of being acted upon as an audience member, remains central and is a tantalizing mystery. Then actor and spectator interpenetrate. So this became, I won't dwell too much on this, but this became an important kind of a movement in the theater. So there was a review in the Village Voice in which she says, the reviewer, theater, the spectator usually becomes reducible. And this is again something that, what Maria Irene Fornes is trying to do. And therefore the spectator risks losing his identity. So how do you ensure that the identity is put back onto the spectator? But one can't say he goes on stage or he is the stage and the stage becomes the spectator. Sometimes the risk is minor or non-existence, assuming identity is not already lost. And sometimes if the actors do not come off to meet him, he does go on stage. So again, in Ronsoni's production of Orlando Furioso, the stage comes forth to meet him or surround him. And likewise in Maria Irene Fornes' own staging of her play, Fefu and Friends, there is an alienating intimacy, and which again is something that she referred to or borrowed from Ronsoni's own production. So the audience goes from room to room and sees the repeated scenes and then relives that. And again, this is part of this whole thing about, giving the identity back to the audience member. And then what Blaw does is that he talks of 2 or 3 other experiences similar to this. One is Richard Schneischer's environmental theater, where at the performance garage in Soho, where you could climb a scaffold to get another purchase on the action, or shift around the scene to get another change in your point of view of the same kind of a production. Then there is, of course, the kind of things that we've all experienced when we go to a musical concert, rock concert, or what have you, or even sort of the kind of warm-up exercises that some of us must have seen on YouTube at the Toyota factories across the world. And also what Grotowski tried to do with some of his earliest work, where spectators are invited as guests, and then they sit around the dining table or the feasting table, and Dr. Faustus is being performed. So Dr. Faustus serves them, or Dr. Faustus's, attendants serve the people. So idea is again that you are an intimate part of the action, something akin to what happened with me when I went to see the Miss Julia production in Kulsum Terrace. Or as Ortod had imagined, or through which the spectator is encouraged to move, as in the converted factories, which was again a borrowing from what the Toyota guys had done in the theater of the Doseol. And so there are a whole lot of other instances, but I suppose this would give a kind of an indication of what she's trying to do with space and time. A lot of these things are also performance specific. So again, to what extent the success of it can be measured or not measured is something only those who have been a part of that theater experience can probably tell us. Yeah. Point number 8 is playwriting. And this again, like I stressed on language, I'll just sort of, and I know we are 5. Okay, I should be hurrying this. So it's theater, playwriting specifically is a very peculiar beast. All right. It's not only about content. It's not only about language. It's not only about the characters. It's also about the, structure. And again, this is a much sort of, abused kind of a term. For me, I think I will give some good example, because in this play, the structure is very fragile in Fefu and Friends. And what she's been able to do requires great craft and technique. But just to illustrate what she's doing in Fefu and Friends, I'll just give you 3 or 4 examples, 1 or 2 from theater, one from couple of them from literature. Theater is also literature. I mean, playwriting is also literature. So a favorite play of mine is Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. And, like all of us, one has read it, seen it hundreds of times. Then more recently, because I was consuming a lot of detective murder mysteries and crime fiction novels and all of that kind of thing, I realized that Oedipus Rex by Sophocles is probably the first and the best murder mystery that I have come across. And this was again like one of those moments where, the penny drops, is simply because Oedipus is the detective in the play. And what is actually transpiring is that he is trying to figure out what happened. And at the end of the whole thing, realizes that he himself is the main, perpetrator of the big crime. So the detective, in a way, like, a good noir film, is actually the one who, the detective captures himself. And it is an absolutely astonishing feat by someone like Sophocles to have been able to do that, to take something of that and, turn the structure completely, upside down. And again, it's a marvelous feat. Another very interesting usage of structure is a novel which again I read recently by Dickens, one of his last novels called Our Mutual Friend. And again, the reason I mention it is because a lot of what happens in Fefu and Friends is like chapter 2 of Our Mutual Friend. So for those of you who's not familiar, so like most of Dickens, Our Mutual Friend also transpires in London. Like a lot of Beckett and like a lot of Waiting for Godot, it's about the dregs of human society. It's the people whom we have forgotten or we want to forget, and we want to push away those migrants who are going to walk, thousands of miles to their home. Dickens is writing about them and he's celebrating that. The first chapter is basically on the Thames, which is again, Dickens's muse. There's a boat, there's a man and a woman on it. And basically what they're doing is they are hunting for dead corpses, dead bodies, corpses in the river. And they fish out these corpses and pick up whatever is there, like, rings, necklaces, wallets, what have you. And then once they've done that and cleaned the dead body of all these, material material things, then they turn the body into the police station and get a reward for that as well, as missing body and all that kind of thing. So this is the first chapter in a way, and again, beautifully described, in that, and it's a great piece of modern prose writing, even though again written about 150 years ago. A cut to the second chapter in this book, which is transpiring in this, the pastry crowd of London, and it's totally la-di-da, and it's a spectacular evening, and everyone is having a great time. There's wine, and people are toasting to each other's health. And halfway through that chapter, you realize the conversations are going absolutely nowhere, and you are just having this sense of the futility of human conversation. And then Dickens does what Dickens does best, which is towards the end of the second chapter, we come to know that someone has died, and that there is an inheritance which has to be passed on to us, probably a son, a foster son probably, who is returning to England. But lo and behold, that chap has gone missing. And then it's left to you to make the connection between chapter 1 and 2, that is it possible that the person who was to come back to collect this huge fortune is probably one of those bodies which were fished out by that man and woman on the boat, and so on and so forth. And when I was giving that whole description of off stage, this is precisely what is happening in Fefu and Her Children, is that this is actually the chapter 2 of Our Mutual Friend is where Fefu and Her Children start. And there's obviously something very dark which has transpired prior to the beginning of the first act of Fefu and Her Children. And that is what, when we say structure, this is what we mean. And this is the payoff. And then the dialogues and the smattering. So the characters, those 8 people, they are in the know of whatever is happening. And we, the audience, like in the case of Oedipus Rex, we are having to solve that crime as we move along. There are other plays which do this thing with time and structure beautifully. One is Pinter's Betrayal, and again I mentioned this because it's a play, and Pinter is a contemporary of Irene Maria Ferner. So in Betrayal, basically it's a love affair. There are 3 characters, but what Pinter does is he plays with time and he moves backwards. So he starts off with the then, and then moves backwards. So typically what would happen is in a natural play with about 7 scenes, you have a husband and a wife. Then after, as in Fefu and Her Friends, she points out that after 7 years and 7 months, the arithmetical formula for falling out of love, the wife then decides that she's going to have a lover, and then what happens, and then the husband comes to know, then the showdown between the husband and the lover, etc. So Pinter turns this whole thing and starts off with what happens with the lover walking off into the horizon and then coming back. So we, the audience, are aware, like in Oedipus Rex, but we are moving backwards into time with each of the units. So this is again what one means when one says structure. And this is what she's kind of doing. And again, good playwriting, and this is again a very fine example, and again something that we need to study, is something that generally works out the end, and then and that's the reason to mention Betrayal, Pinter's Betrayal, is that generally knows the end, like the classical, this thing of hitting the sum and then building the sort of dark system around that. So for example, if you remember your King Lear, at the end of the 5th act, after Cordelia's death and so on and so forth, and you have the final gaze that Lear has, and then he says that famous line of, is this the promised end? Shakespeare has obviously worked the text out backwards in terms of structure from there. Or Mrs. Alving in Ibsen's play, that famous scream at the end, which punctuates the end of that particular thing. Or even Baal's eyes in Brecht's play, or for that matter in Beckett's play, where Ham's eyelids are shut for the final time, and he says, "Me to play old game," end of those famous lines in Endgame, "Me to play old Endgame, lost a fold, done with losing," and since that's the way we are going to play it and speak no more about it. So good playwrights generally have figured that kind of an end, and then they have worked their way backwards through that. And that is again important, because in Fefu, as I pointed out earlier, that last line, and those, that entire passage, it's something that is like a music structure, very, very, very carefully worked out. It's not something that is, left to chance. And again, as theater students, as literature students, is something that we need to, take cognizance of how we, look at these things, because it's not the same as closure in a novel or closure in, in other forms of literature. The ninth point is fairly is something that I should have started off this conversation with, is patriarchy. And just a week ago, I mean, a few days ago, we lost one of our, major, most important, I suppose, women activist, Sonal Shukla. And she was sort of founder of Vacha, which is an organization in Mumbai, and they've been doing work for the last 40, 50 years in terms of reading literacy or spreading literacy for girls. And Vacha, for those of you who don't know, especially young students, is a community library located in Mumbai, and where they very consciously tried to create and provide literature by women, for women, among a lot of the members and others. And their thing was that you cannot sort of contest patriarchy if all the time you're reading literature by men for men, kind of thing, or even literature by men for women. So therefore, very conscious attempt to, have women authors, also to, commission women authors and so on. So there are a couple of things that she had mentioned. One is, for example, Chavanprash, how much of Chavanprash there is in a typical Indian household, and how usually that Chavanprash is for the boy and very little goes to the girl in a typical Indian household. And especially in these last 18 to 20 months, what has been happening, and with wage cuts and income cuts and whatever. Again, she said something interesting in just a few days before she exited the planet, is that we are all familiar with the word boyhood. But if you type girlhood on Google, or even in your dictionary, this thing, you will find a red line appears under it. And this is how sort of deeply embedded patriarchy is, and at what level and to what extent it sort of extends itself. And to deprogram ourselves from that becomes very difficult. So again, just to understand, prior to the writing of Fefu and her children, even in India, if you look at the the big four, you had Tendulkar, you had Karnad, you had Mohan Rakesh, you had Badal Babu, Badal Sarkar, and their depiction of women in our society. So in the case of Tendulkar Saab, it was obviously what happens in Sakaram with, the kind of woman Lakshmi is, the kind of woman Champa is, or for that matter in Gidhade and so many other of these women. What happens even with the playwright like Girish Karnad in Aivadan, and finally the woman who wants to, the selection of the binary between the two, brain versus muscle, and then finally, like Hedda Gabler, sacrificed at the altar of self-sacrifice. Likewise with Mohan Rakesh, be it the women in Aadhe Adhure, be it what happens to Mallika in Ashad Ka Ek Din, or even Lehro, or for that matter, even if you read his other, literature, Andhere Band Kamre or Antaral, what happens with the relationship between Nirmal and Harbans, etc. This kind of male gaze on the women's society. So therefore, what again transpires within Fefu is also a dismantling of this structure. And I have written a lot, but I suppose I should be sort of considerate and leave some time for conversation. So I'll just read what she has done, because I think it's important. Let me just find the page. So this is from On the Lawn, in the second unit of the play production. So those of you who've read, there is the bench or the tree stump. Fefu and Emma bring boxes of potatoes, carrots, beets, etc. Fefu wears a hat and gardening gloves, and again this whole thing of activity, which is marvelous, and If you remember that whole scene about her repairing the toilet and the plumbery that she's doing. Anyway, Emma enters, she's carrying a box, Fefu exits. Do you think about genitals all the time? Fefu says, genitals? No, I don't think about genitals all the time. Emma, I do, and it drives me crazy. Each person I see in the street and anywhere at all, I keep thinking of their genitals, what they look like, what position they are in. I think it's odd that everyone has them. Don't you, Fefu? No, I don't think. It would be odder if they don't have them. Emma laughs, Fefu re-enters. Emma says, I mean, people act as if they don't have genitals, right? Fefu, how do people with genitals act? Emma, I don't know how businessmen and women stand in a room and discuss business without even one reference to their genitals. I mean, everybody has them. They just pretend they don't. Fefu, I see. Shifting her glance from left to right with a fiendish look. You mean they should do this all the time? Emma laughs. Emma, no, I don't mean that. Think of it. Don't you think I'm right, Fefu? Yes, I think you're right. Oh, Emma. Now, again, this is a longish tradition of this kind of, vivacious ribaldry, but there's always the way the male playwright is writing. And one very good instance of this is Lysistrata, for those of you who've read the sort of, one of the early anti-war or sort of, plays where basically you have these two people of these two lands going to war, and the women decide that what is the best way towards pacifism, and they're talking that language, and the way to prevent their men from this kind of jingoistic patriotism is to banish sex from their life, and the whole play is a celebration of that. How women try to curb this sort of animal instinct among men to go to war by doing that. But again, in that particular play, Lysistrata is obviously trying to do something different, But this sense of ribaldry, the way, the male gazes and how we are seeing it in Fefu. Then Emma says, that's my name. Well, you see, it's generally believed that you go to heaven and you're good. If you're bad, you go to hell. That is correct. However, in heaven, they don't judge goodness the way we think. Again, this whole thing of morality. They don't. They have a divine registry of sexual performance. In that registry, they mark down every little sexual activity in your life. If your faith is not entirely in it, you just perform as an obligation and you don't feel the most profound devotion. If your spirit, your heart, and your flesh is not religiously delivered on it, you're condemned. They put you down in the blacklist and you don't go to heaven. Heaven is populated with divine lovers, and in hell live the duds. Fefu says that's probably true. Emma, I knew you would see it that way. Fefu, oh, I do. You see, on earth, we are judged by public acts, and sex is a private act. A partner cannot be said to be the public, since both partners are engaged. So naturally, it stands to reason that it's angels who judge our sexual life. Emma says naturally, and so on and so forth. And then Fefu says, you always bring joy to me. Emma says, thank you. And then there's this one short little bit by Fefu, and then I'll conclude this. I thank you, Emma. I am in constant pain. I don't want to give into it. If I do, I'm afraid I'll never recover. It's not physical and it's not sorrow. It's very strange, Emma. I can't describe it, and it's very frightening. It is as if normally there is a lubricant, not in the body, a spiritual lubricant. It's hard to describe, and without it, life is a nightmare and everything is distorted. A black cat started coming to my kitchen. He's awfully mangled and big. He's missing an eye and his skin is diseased. At first, I was repelled by him, but then I thought, this is a monster that has been sent to me and I must feed him. And I fed him. One day he came and shat all over my kitchen. Foul diarrhea. He still comes and I still feed him. I'm afraid of him. Emma kisses Fefu. How about a little lemonade? Yes. How about a grain of croquet? Fine. And then, so on and so forth. I'll also share, because, we've just been focusing on this one particular playwright, but and this is a thing I believe in, not just in, like I mentioned, where Mohan Rakesh, Tendulkar, Badal Babu, etc. All these people, playwrights hunt in a pack. And whenever there is a theatre tradition, it obviously means that there are many more. So I'll just end with a quotation by Wendy Wesselstein. She was a contemporary, and she wrote a few plays. So, for instance, she wrote Any Woman Can't in 1973. She wrote again, a magnificent piece of writing called Heidi's Chronicles. That was, I think, 1988. Uncommon Women and Others. And Isn't It Romantic, 1983. Anyway, the reason to share these dates is that so I have this book of American playwrights. I don't know if you can see, or there's a light glare right behind me. Now, again, interesting because it's got a whole bunch of playwrights, all male, and it's only Wendy Wasserstein who is the sort of woman playwright in this. Okay. So she says it's an interview that was conducted. Is drawn from two meetings. The first took place in '92, and when Sister Rosenweig opened in the Broadway, and then they're meeting in her apartment and so on. And the second meeting is taking place during the rehearsals of another play of hers called American Daughters. And she says something which I think in a way also helps us decode some of what, Irene Maria Fornes is trying to do. I've noticed that you use the word girl a lot, is what the interviewer tells her. And Wasserstein says, I have been called on the table for years on that. I call myself a Jewish girl. Maybe it's because you can't correct semantically who in your heart you know you are. But in the last 5 years, feminism has opened up to humor. Women who are a bit older can believe in something and also see it ironically. And younger women who once thought that to be a feminist you had to be anti-marriage, have no sense of humor, and have hairy legs are changing. When I saw Marlene Coyle speak at the convention in 1992, I thought everything I do is anathema to this woman. She thinks I will rot and I will boil in hell. But I think of her exactly what she thinks of me. Poor, poor woman. Feminism has affected me more in my writing than in a specifically political way. Sitting down to write a play that has 3 parts for women over 40, I think that act is deeply, deeply political. And so on and so forth about other characters. We won't get into that because she's a different playwright and with a coming from a totally different tradition. So yeah, how are we on time, Professor Reena?
Ramu, how much more time would you need?
I'm sort of done. I have something by Albee on Beckett, but that I can, we can listen to that later in case others want to respond. I mean, this has just gone on and on. No? For others, it might be a bit much.
Okay, so yeah, so maybe we, after the Q&A, if there are people who are still around, we'd love to hear what you want to say. Yeah,
sure.
Great.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Arya now.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you. That was a really nice, really exhaustive and comprehensive talk, covering all aspects of theater and literature, and unpacking it from 10 different angles. And it was enriching, not just in terms of it being a text in our syllabus, but also, I mean, locating it in the larger tradition of theater and playwriting. So thank you so much for this. We'll open it up to questions now. So how it works is, and anyone can either put the question in the chat box, which we can read, or if anybody raises their hands, I can also give them permission to unmute. That is something I can do. So yeah.
I think Suniti has written something. So if you unmute Suniti can read her question.
I'll just do that.
And somebody else also. Yeah.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah, Suniti, you're audible.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ramu, for this wonderful and such an exhaustive talk. It's always such a pleasure to listen to you because we're always sitting with our notebooks and taking, spurious kind of notes. So I do remember the last time you came, and it was again a wonderful workshop on how to write plays and how to go about playwriting. And you had mentioned and you had referred to Arthur Miller, and apart from saying that the purpose of theater is to utter a truth, you also gave like certain tips about how to write a play. And one of the tips was to kind of go to the, to these places where these dregs are, which you mentioned here, and to go on these streets and to kind of, mingle with people and have a good ear, as Miller also sort of suggested. And I was wondering then, I probably could not ask you back then, is that women can't be at all such places always, as you also mentioned, these other women who are outside of Sulabh, and that was the only time they could get out. And I was wondering what would, how would women write plays? And I was sitting with that question and wondering, if I had to write a play tomorrow, what is the language I would pick up? What would I talk about? So how do you see Fornes kind of using the theatre of absurd, first of all, which is again a very masculine kind of method as far as, the popular playwrights are concerned, Beckett, Pinter, all these people, and how does she work through that limitation, which all of us, all women who want to become perhaps playwrights would
Yep.
sort of feel themselves within. Yeah.
Sure. So how do we do this? Should I respond to each question, or we
It's entirely
collect a
up to you.
couple? Yeah.
What
So
would you
we
like
could probably collect. Yeah, we could collect a couple. So it also helps me process. So I mean, the problem with the Zoom thing is that you're talking to yourself. So I mean, if I get a sense of 2-3 questions, then I could get a
Sure.
sense of then we could draw, and that also gives
Sure.
others a little time. Yeah. Thanks.
Absolutely. Ela has a question. Ela, you're here. Arya, if
Yeah.
you could.
Yeah, this is Vijaya. It's my daughter's name by mistake. Anyway, I wanted to ask with how is Indian aesthetics, Abhinav Gupta and all those, how do you relate, or how do you connect that to the theatre of absurd? Is there
so that would be another 2-hour talk, I suspect. So maybe next 14th of September. I mean, I don't want to give a glib answer, which is not suitable. But yeah, no, that might require. But I could give. Let me think about it. Yeah, we could maybe collect a couple more, and then we can come back to it. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other hands that are raised, Arya? Is there anyone else who has a question?
No hands raised. Punarnava had asked questions in the questions section here. She says, she asked, do we witness a scene of Russian roulette in the last scene of the play, Fefu and Friends? I can unmute her if she wants to elaborate. Ma'am, should
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure. Punarnava, are you still here?
Yeah, I will just. Yeah. Also, I had a question. So,
Please.
Sorry. So it was, I mean, from the very beginning, when you were talking about the aspect of space. I mean, the play starts out with the instructions, right? That where, I mean, how the first, second, and third acts will go, and so the aspect of the audience is it's very present in this play, and so when especially in the second act, when the audience is taken from 4 different sections and shown what's happening, so it just led me to think that because there's such an aspect of this is what I'm showing to you from the playwright, it also leads me to think then if this is what is being shown, then there's an obvious presence of something that's not being shown. So yeah, that's just
yeah. Fine. What I'll do is I'll respond to this one, and then we'll go to the other questions. So no, good question. So 2-3 things. You see, there is, fortunately or unfortunately, theater is a habit. This whole thing of, us going into a auditorium which is darkened at a particular moment, and then, the 3 bells and, that whole ritual, and then the curtain parting or opening, and or if it's a kind of a thrust stage, then whatever happening. So number one. Number two is that entire act itself has a certain tyranny to it, all right? And there is a kind of, I mean, there is a sort of deja vu-ness about the whole thing. Whenever, if you watch 100 plays, 200 plays, 300 plays, etc. It's what to some extent happened with, contemporary modern art, that there is a frame, and how do contemporary modern painters try to get out of that frame, and what more can they do, or what in addition to that, what are the things that can be done, or what some of the filmmakers are trying to do, with say meta narratives or interactive interface and things like that. So within the theater, with whatever limitations it has, because the space itself is finite, it's also located. um, uh, there was a realization that the very act of going to the theater almost became church-like. It became like attending Sunday mass and sermon, and there was a very strict code of conduct between the papal priest who's giving the Sunday sermon to us, the congregation who's listening to it. So how do you really change that equation? Because it is an equation of equals, not one where there is somebody sermonizing, as if he or she is on the red fort, and all of us merely have to nod our heads in agreement. So I think somewhere 2, 3 things were happening. One was deconstruction of that performance space, which I think is very, very crucial. And when I was reading those Herbert Bloch things, he has of course cited about 100 of these examples where there has been a very, very systematic attempt at breaking this. In India too, we have had in our own sort of informal agitprop way many of these instances which have transpired. I mentioned a couple of them, which are more in the privileged elite space, but there are more instances. So that is one thing, this deconstruction of that kind of a space. And also somewhere to include the audience as part of the performance space, to make it fresh for the actors and to make it, a kind of a unique thing. Since I am reading Stoppard, I'll share something that he said, and I think so in this particular biography by Hermione Lee, he says that, it's interesting, we as playwrights, people like him, of course, that when we write plays, we believe in the supremacy of the word and we believe in the supremacy of the text and all of that. But my memory of a good play is always a visual metaphor that I've taken away from it, be it his own plays or be it other play productions that I have seen. So somewhere, even in Fefu and Her Children, I think what happens is those 1,000, 1,500 people who have gone through that experience of moving around in the theater space in that kind of a manner would probably come away from that play remembering the experience of sitting in that play in those 4 units or 4 compartments or whatever, and going away from the play with that, and then of course subsequently happens. So it's in any case, it's a very clever device, and that's all it is. One must not sort of overread into it. And then the second thing is, of course, how much theater management, which is the real estate part of it, is open and amenable to these kind of experiments. Not every theater management. So a playwright tomorrow, there might be 10 playwrights among y'all who might say that this is a great idea, let's execute it. The problem is going to be the actual nitty-gritties of it. Say in if you're trying to do it in India, that theater management's first approach to something like this is going to be, no, we can't do this. This is against our rules. We can't let thousands of people just wander around backstage and in the green rooms, etc. Being a part of our theater space, it's a fire hazard, or it's those kind of. So there are 3 parts to it. One is the politics or the cultural politics to it, which is the deconstruction of space. The second part of it is the theater device element of it, which Stoppard alludes to. That is the visual metaphor that you always take away from these things. And third is the nitty-gritties. So in most instances, you have a playwright who's aware. She would obviously have been aware of at least 3 theaters in New York, something in Boston, Chicago, where this is doable. Then you go for it. All right. So that is the answer to this particular question. As regards what can be written, it's always extremely difficult to say to anybody, but one of my heroes is somebody called Svetlana Alexievich, and I always manage to mention her wherever one talks. And she, as you know, is a Nobel laureate from Belarus. And now that Kabul and Afghanistan is in the news, she's also written 2 extraordinary testimonials or memoirs about what happened there. Her first major work was something that emerged from Chernobyl. And basically what she did was recorded the voices of the women who were survivors in what transpired in Chernobyl back in the 1980s. And then, of course, used her writer skills in terms of, transcribing the text, and then, of course, locating it into this body text and doing that. And then subsequently, she extended this whole exercise where basically what she does is collect voices. And a lot of people say that this is journalism and this is just chronicling, it's not literature. But personally, I feel this is, the best example of tapping into voices, and B, tapping into a whole host of voices. And subsequently, this method became so popular that what she started doing, and this is what I've heard from some common friends, is that she started distributing these tiny dictaphones to actually women in the community, because she realized that one Svetlana Alexeyevich is not enough to reach out to so many, because there are so many stories out there which are unsaid. Every household has a million stories to tell. Every woman has great epics to sort of narrate to us. So she used to hand over these dictaphones to various community leaders within that community, and they would then in turn record the voices of people around them, grandparents, grandmothers, aunts, village, shopkeepers, and those kind of things. And it's just a huge and enormous repository of stories that they have collected, and but again, what frightens you is that is still just 1% of what is achievable. But that definitely is a way to do this. And now with technology being on our side a little bit in some instances, I think this is a good way to collect these kind of stories in this kind of way. Somebody just pinged which book of hers. Well, I mean, the name is Svetlana Alexeyevich. She's a Nobel laureate, I think 2011 or 12, that you can check on the Nobel site. She's Belarusian. So, I mean, each book by her is a masterpiece. I mean, ideally, you should read all of her books. I think it's Secondhand Time, but I don't remember the name about Afghanistan, the Afghanistan book, rather. Yep. Yeah. So these are the answers to these questions.
Am I unmuted? I'm Rupa Dhawan. Am I unmuted?
Hello.
Yeah, Rupa,
Yes.
you are. We can hear you.
Okay. I will. Thanks for this wonderful talk. I am I was particularly interested in this talk because, we are teachers of in literature departments, so we end up teaching plays by looking at the written word, and we don't have too much experience with actually participating in the staging of such plays, or even witnessing. I mean, a lot of the plays that we teach, we have not even seen stage performances of them very often. Now, of course, it's easier because there's YouTube and we have some semblance of some kind of, performance viewing possible. But to be involved in the production of a play, and to then realize what are the kinds of issues that playwrights are dealing with. That's what's so fascinating about your talk, because you're looking at it from that vantage point, and plus you have so much theory that you're also talking about. So you've given us the best of both experiences, and I am particularly interested in what you, of course, have touched upon while you're talking about this play, which is the second part of Fefu and Her Friends, because that's the part where the logistics of staging, is something that, as a teacher of Fefu, I will have to address that theoretically without actually having seen that happen, and you're absolutely right. If foreigners wants to stage the second part of Fefu and Her Friends in 4 separate spaces, so if she wants to divide the audience into four groups, I mean, that's the original structure of the play, that the audience, so let's say there are 400 people in the audience. And so you've got 4 groups of 100 people each. And in the second part of the play, each group goes to a separate space. So you've got to have and watch one scene in that second part. Then they get up and they exit and they move into another place and they watch the second part of that. So and it's like a musical chairs, because the other groups are also watching. So they're not watching. They're watching the second part of the play in different sequence. Their starting points are different. Now the thing is, you're right. I mean, how would you, if you're a playwright, you would have to, in order to accomplish this, you would have to stage your play in a place where there are 5 rooms. One is the living room where part 1 and part 1 and part 3 of the play is staged, and then there are 4 separate places. You've got to find a theater place which has 4 separate spaces where it is possible to, and then, as you said, there's all kinds of logistic problems about how can you have 100 people moving from one place to another in the play. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about this and to tell us what you think about how, because I know for a fact that because perhaps of the difficulty of staging this, not all productions of Fefu and Her Friends have done it this way, because many productions of Fefu and Her Friends simply do not divide the audience into 4 and have them walk from one place to another, because logistically they can't. So I wonder, I mean, what would you...
No, it's a good question, because it's a challenge. So one is, of course, you select the play in such a way that, so one of the things I always mention is that theater is about 2 things. One is language, which I have been dwelling on. The second is space. And any good playwright, right from, when I say opening, it's not just that first line, but it's also just where you locate that place, because where these people say what they say is equally important. So this is something that needs to be kept in mind. And so obviously when she designed this play this particular way, that was something foremost in her mind. You see, if you travel to the Western countries and you see the kind of privileged audiences that go into this, there is a comfort level that they've gone. And she's obviously trying to, she's trying to be disruptive, to use a 21st century terminology. She's definitely trying to be disruptive within that tradition. So that is point 1. Point number 2 is theater people are shana. I mean, this is the Indian word. They're shana in the sense that they will use space very, very inventively. So it's not always about putting it on the stage space. So the stage space is one component in a theater building. You have lobbies, you have green rooms, you have the backstage area. In some theaters, for example, where I come from, you have about 20 of these stage theaters, and out of that, about 16 of them, the backstage area is bigger than the stage area, simply because there are plays in the wings which are getting ready to come on, because Bombay works in this shift system. Everything, I mean, not now because of the COVID, but otherwise, so the backstage areas are enormous. So what would typically happen in something like this is you deploy that kind of space. You use the space in the wings, which is massive. So you pull out all the wings and you pull out everything, it goes up, and that kind of a space is available. Now, again, all this is incumbent on the fact that theater management, producer, because there's a cost to all this in India, at least. So that is point number 2, that how it is done is the question of nitty-gritties. Then, then you get a stage designer in and so on. There's a challenge. The playwright has given you a challenge. I mean, in the good old days of Parsi theater, the pit used to open, and when Rana Prithviraj Chauhan would shoot the arrow, that fellow on the horse would dive straight into the pit. I mean, and the logistics of it is just, wo actor girta hai aur wo girta wohi pit ke andar, which is 1/2 in size. And then and it's not just that, because the audience says once more, the fellow climbs the horse again, and again Prithviraj Chauhan shoots the arrow, and again he falls into the pit, and the audience says once more again, and again he does that. So these kind of things are mind-boggling. So, but there is a way around it. That's the logistics part of it. The third thing is, as I mentioned, theater walas are shana. So there are ways to do this. I mean, it's not always that you need to mount this in a big way. So you can have your regular production in the proscenium stage. But I have a friend or a theater professional friend, let's put it like a theater friend, okay, from the city of Leipzig in Germany, who does a lot of his theater out of a briefcase. So what he basically does is he has these little puppets which are there in the briefcase. He opens his briefcase, and then the characters in the briefcase become the characters in the play. And then he uses multiple voices and he talks in those voices and he presents the play. Now, this is typically for audiences of size of 25, 50. Now, when I read this particular text, and like you, I was that how will one solve this? How do you crack this problem or find a solution to this problem? If I was to direct this play, then this would be my solution to the whole thing, that I actually have something like this suitcase, briefcase theater, larger briefcase. So the kinds in which you pack your, when you're traveling overseas, the 20 kilos, 25 kilos one, you open it, it's done in a very theatrical way. And then you have the stage in that briefcase. And then you have actors lending voices to these characters and doing that. The audience has an other experience. They know that we are true to what the playwright has wanted us to do in terms of intent. And you have these small groups which watch this. We do the 4 briefcases or suitcases, whatever you want to call it. So again, like I said, this is just a solution. There are many solutions. You can do it with puppets. You can do it with hand puppets. You can do it with, miniature theater. You can do it with sound and, audio. So like I said, solution to this is there are that can manifest itself in a variety of ways. So that I don't think is necessarily a thing. Space does not always mean the physical space on which a play is staged. There are ways in which you can, manipulate that space. And good theater people have done that in the past. You can also go vertical. I mean, there are again clever and imaginative ways to do this, and it can be done. It's not such a big problem. It can be done. And we are always breaking groups into smaller groups. A good example is when you have these tourist walks, and when it becomes a bit big when you're walking around in a fort or you're walking around in a city tour. They're always breaking you up into these small groups. So it can also be just a show and tell. So again, it's just a question of how you want to take the audience on that ride. So that can be done. That can be done. Yeah, I'm sort of done with it.
I think everybody's been unmuted. So if anyone has questions, you can just go ahead.
Santosh.
Sorry, we couldn't hear you.
I have now I have a meaning in life to survive and stay alive in life.
I'm not sure what that was, whether they were talking to us or not. Punarnava had a question. Would you want to elaborate on that question?
Sorry, what was the? I'm sorry.
No, I was asking. No, I was asking her if she wanted to. She had asked.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought I missed out on a question. Sorry.
No, you hear Punarnava?
No, she's not here. She's not
here?
in the meeting. She's left, ma'am. She's not here right now. She had asked whether the last scene of the play, do we witness a scene of Russian roulette?
That is a big. I mean, actually, the entire third act is something that needs to be discussed at length. I mean, it's not something to which one should again give. Like that question about Indian aesthetics and theater of the absurd. I mean, I think one should not just give a glib one-line answer saying that this is what it is. It is one of the possibilities. It is one of the interpretations, and it can be looked at. I think it's an interesting interpretation. But then again, one has to see through and look at line and cause and effect, etc., and then work out whether it has a kind of a theater logic to it. I mean, that is basically what generally happens. So So, but yeah, like I said, that it's one of the many possibilities.
I think we've
So,
exhausted Ramu also. So
yeah.
Arya,
So not exhausted.
to close, in
Yeah.
case there are no questions. Thank you, Ramu. This was out and discuss now in the class.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you again so much, sir, for this talk. Yeah, this was really helpful. And ma'am, should I stop the recording then now? If nobody has anybody has any more questions, I think not. So I'll stop the recording here, and